Still, just because the LGBTQIA+ community has become more openly accepted in the mainstream media today, doesn't mean we should forget about the struggles that older generations faced. In this episode of The Glorious Beard, we're going to talk about one small snippet of queer history to celebrate Pride Month, the beard.
Welcome to The Glorious Beard. Today's episode, well, of course it's all about beards, but in a variety of ways. And to kick off June, we are, of course, celebrating Pride Month. We're going to start off with beards that you don't necessarily grow, but those that took on a completely different meaning within the LGBTQ+ community. A beard in that community is known as someone who helps someone else to hide who they really are. And it's kind of a performance shaped by pressure, protection, and oftentimes survival. We'll also pull back and look at the bigger picture because, of course, beards have always carried significant meaning. We're going to get into the strange history of beard tax, especially when it came to what they represented and who really wanted to have them. We're also going to look at the bold and cultural statements of beards around the American Civil War. And we'll look at a story about one of the most, if not the absolute most famous bearded woman in history, who turned heads, challenged norms, and changed everything in 20th century France. So, there's a lot to cover today on The Glorious Beard, but before we get started, I'd like to invite you to head over to our SpeakPipe and leave us a message. You can go to speakpipe.com/gloriousbeard voicemail and leave us a message of 90 seconds or less. It can be really about anything. About this episode, a previous episode, what you've heard, what you like, what you don't like. Let us know how we're doing at speakpipe.com/gloriousbeard voicemail. We're going to begin this episode by taking a look at a term that's been part of queer culture for decades. Beard. Not the facial hair, but the person. In LGBTQ+ circles, a beard is someone, who is often of the opposite sex, who's brought into a relationship or made to seem like a partner in order to help someone else appear to be straight. Kind of like a workaround, a survival tactic. Sometimes it's planned and understood by both people, while other times it's not. The idea of this isn't anything new, but it's rarely talked about outside of the community. And it raises questions about how people navigate their identity in public, the pressures to conform, and about the emotional weight of relationships that exist more for safety than they do romance. And in some cases, people who serve as beards know exactly what role they're playing, while in others, they only find out later, and it can be complicated.
The recent rise of Chappell Roan and her explicitly queer art and music based on drag queens is a reminder of how far our society has come in only a few decades. Just a few years ago, coming out was a death sentence in a person's career. And yet nowadays, Chappell is attracting record numbers of fans to music festivals and millions of streams. Still, just because the LGBTQIA+ community has become more openly accepted in the mainstream media today, doesn't mean we should forget about the struggles that older generations faced. In this episode of The Glorious Beard, we're going to talk about one small snippet of queer history to celebrate Pride Month, the beard. A beard refers to someone who dates a homosexual person so that they can better hide their sexuality. Oftentimes, this specifically indicates a man who dates a lesbian, where their beard, a symbol of their masculinity, covers up any possibility that they could be queer. But the term is often used the other way around as well. Don't wanna change the lyrics in my love songs. I've been hiding feelings now for too long. Before it became associated with the LGBTQIA+ community, a beard was used instead to cover up infidelity in a marriage. The homewrecker would openly display their relationship to another person, so the spouse of the cheater wouldn't become suspicious.
Went out last night, had a
It was only in the early 1900s that the term was popularized in its modern context, when homosexual relationships were becoming more common, but homophobia was particularly rampant. During this period, newspapers put out lists of potentially gay individuals, and that exposure often meant losing your job or your social standing. It was imperative for many to hide their identities to survive.
went out last night with a crowd of my friends. Been Muslim women, 'cause I don't like no men.
The term became particularly well known in describing celebrities in Hollywood, many of whom were pressured or willingly chose to enter into relationships with members of the opposite sex to conceal their identities. There are many instances of famous examples of this. Elton John was married to a woman for much of his life and didn't acknowledge it himself until a full 2 decades into his career. More recently, model and actor Colton Haynes notoriously had a beard and then came out, only to stop receiving roles. The LGBTQ beard has long been a way to hide so that people in the public eye can keep their privacy.
Basically having to go back into the closet for my career was really damaging for me. Having to take movement for the actor classes to fix my mannerisms, and having to put post-it notes and things under my tongue to fix my lisps, and having to talk an octave lower. It can be really detrimental to your mental health.
But it comes at a cost. These people can't be their true selves. Forced to hide behind a heterosexual mask that they can't readily shake, the world forces men in the public eye to be something they are not. Identity and self-purpose shouldn't be taken for granted. Colton Haynes shouldn't be blackballed for who he is. No one should. And the LGBTQ beard is symbolic of that constant struggle for identity and purpose. LGBTQIA+ people are an important part of world history and culture. The LGBTQ beard plays an important role in Hollywood, but it comes at a great price. People like Colton Haynes and Elton John were forced into secrecy for most of their lives because of who they are. Beards are a fascinating yet painful part of the LGBTQ history. And here at the Glorious Beard, where every beard has a story, we think it's high time we live in a world where the LGBTQ beard finally goes out of style.
Thanks for listening to today's episode of The Glorious Beard. I wanted to remind you that you can always go to thegloriousbeard.com and check out everything that we've got going on, which includes all of our episodes, the different things that you might hear on one of our episodes, and much, much more. That's thegloriousbeard.com. This episode of the Glorious Beard podcast is brought to you by Building Bridges for Brianna, a nonprofit working to prevent loss from mental health crises. Founded in memory of 15-year-old Brianna Dorgan, the organization connects individuals and families with the support and resources that they need, while also helping communities to talk more openly about mental health. To learn more or to get involved, you can visit bb4bpa.org, because nobody should have to face life alone. We're going to move on to a woman now who made history. Clementine Delait was born in France in 1865, and by most accounts, she lived an ordinary life. That was until she decided not to shave. At a time when facial hair on women was treated as something to be ashamed of or even kept hidden, Clementine actually leaned into it. And in the process, she managed to push back against the narrow ideas of gender and appearance, and her life sits at the intersection of performance, autonomy, and what it means to embrace something that others might see as a flaw.
It's around 1900. In the quaint French village of Don-les-Vosges, patrons mill about a small café, ever charmed by the gregarious, heavy-set baker's wife who serves them. One customer happens to boast about his long winter beard. Laughing, the baker's wife bets that she can grow a better beard herself. To the customer's shock, her husband backs her with 500 francs. Of course, everyone laughs along, but lo and behold, a few weeks later, she's sporting a big black bushy beard. The fame that follows is almost immediate. Within a few months, photographers from all over France are clamoring to get a shot of her. And from this moment on, she decides never to shave her beard again. The baker's wife is Clementine Delait, la femme à barbe, or a bearded woman. France's favorite bearded lady had humble beginnings. She was born to farmers on March 5, 1865 in eastern France. In her memoirs, she recounts first noticing her beard as a teenager.
How did my beard grow? I don't quite know. But I can assure you that at 18 years of age, my upper lip was already decorated with a promising down, which agreeably enhanced my brunette skin tone.
In 1885, she fell in love with a local baker named Paul Delait and married him. They opened their café together soon after. As her fame grew, she began selling autographed postcards and other stationery with her likeness. This extra income afforded a more leisurely lifestyle for Paul, who was prone to bouts of sickness. They even changed the name of their café to the Café of the Bearded Woman. Needless to say, business was booming, though the time in which Clementine lived wasn't exactly kind to those who broke the mold. She encountered many who would shame her for her choice not to shave. But her memoirs never mention this. Instead, it's filled cover to cover with pride.
I had a magnificent beard, curly and abundant, which spread out in a double plume.
Although she was loath to take part in the popular freak shows of her time, Clementine would make a couple appearances at fairs in the next few years, the most famous of which involved lions. Described as quite fearless by her husband, she even took part in a stunt in which she played cards and sipped champagne with the lion tamer inside the cage. The best part? It's said she only did it because her sister forbade it. Clementine also recounts having visited a handful of other bearded ladies, like a rather disappointing one in Nancy.
A badly groomed phenomenon, who does not even have the excuse of being from the Auvergne. The poor creature only had a few straggly hair on either side of her face.
Despite this scathing review, she did arrive home from the fair with a new favorite beard pomade. Clementine took the utmost care when it came to her beard. Her barber, Charles Grossier, claimed she would watch him like a hawk whenever he trimmed it. At this time, it was illegal for women to wear men's clothing, but Clementine was exceptional in all things. In 1904, she got special permission from the government of France to wear pants. Although she frequently stressed her identity as a woman, it appears she would often dress up in men's clothing, solely for the fun of messing with people. Clementine also volunteered frequently with the Red Cross during World War I, putting her strength and stature to good use. In 1919, she and Paul adopted a young girl, Fernande, whose parents had perished in the Spanish flu epidemic. Now, between running her cafe and doting on her family, she had little time for anything else, least of all the invitations from circuses and socialites still pouring in. But this all changed after Paul's death in 1926. Needing a change of scenery, Clementine finally began accepting offers to travel, taking her daughter all over Europe. The two even met royalty several times. In her later years, she opened a bar where she starred in cabaret shows. She published her memoirs in 1934 and passed from a stroke that same year. Today, her hometown remembers her extraordinary life in a small museum close to the site of her and Paul's cafe. her legacy enshrined in precious copies of her autographed postcards. More than just photographs, though, Clementine's legacy represents a rare and beautiful example of what can happen when you choose to love yourself. Contrary to most other bearded ladies of her time, Clementine chose to embrace her beard out of pride, not necessity.
It never entered in my head that I could be nothing more than a female curiosity exhibited. I was much more and much better than that.
Even if we aren't all la femme à barbe, all of us encounter a point in our lives where we don't quite fit the mold. Those moments present us with a choice: shame or self-love. In a time and place where women were still violently constrained by societal ideals, Clementine Delait loved herself defiantly, radically, prodigiously. What many called vanity ended up earning her fame, fortune, and most significantly to Clementine, a certain amount of comfort for her ailing husband and beloved daughter. She was a champion of confidence, and if she can do it, so can you.
Thank you for listening to the Glorious Beard podcast. You can always go to our website, thegloriousbeard.com. You can find us on Instagram, The Glorious Beard, and on YouTube as well. And you can go to our SpeakPipe and leave us a message. That's speakpipe.com/gloriousbeard voicemail. Before the American Civil War, beards were not really especially common in the United States. Clean-shaven faces were the standard, especially amongst the upper class and the political elite. But by the time that the war was underway in the 1860s, things like beards and sideburns and mustaches had exploded in popularity, and suddenly, facial hair wasn't only fashion, it was also a statement.
70 years ago, our fathers brought forth upon this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty, and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Now we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation, or any nation so conceived and so dedicated.
After 4 years of fighting, the American Civil War ended on May 9, 1865. The end of the war didn't bring immediate peace, but signaled the direction the country would move, together instead of apart. Today, we salute the 160th anniversary of the end of the war. As an important part of the history of the United States, we reflect on the leaders on both sides that have distinctive beards and facial hair. Facial hair was highly popular during the Civil War, in part due to trends at the time, and also because role models like Abraham Lincoln and other military leaders had facial hair. As a result, many great styles of beards, mustaches, and more stand as distinctive ways of recognizing individuals. Ambrose Everett Burnside was a Union general who controlled the Rhode Island Militia Regiment. In 1862, he was promoted to Major General. However, after several crushing defeats, Burnside resigned. After the war, from 1866 to 69, he served as governor in Rhode Island, then served as a senator from 1875 until his death in 1881. Despite his struggles as a military leader, Ambrose was popular, and his whiskers, one of the more memorable facial hair displays amongst well-known generals. With his shaved chin but grown facial hair along his cheeks, a style of facial hair was soon named after him, what we now call sideburns. James Ewell Brown Stewart was a Confederate cavalry general who stood out for his bravery in the Battle of Bull Run. After several more military successes, he was promoted to Major General and commander of the cavalry troops. Because of his talent as an intelligence officer, General Robert E. Lee nicknamed him the Eyes of the Army. But at the Battle of Yellow Tavern in 1864, Stewart and his troops were defeated, and Stewart himself was wounded and died at the age of 31. There are tales that he earned the nickname Beauty when he was attending West Point, and he was rumored to have grown out a beard sometime afterwards. The beard he kept all throughout the Civil War until his death. He had a long beard and a distinct handlebar mustache as his personal look, which made him stand out among many. Then there's Alpheus Williams. Williams trained volunteer soldiers in Michigan and was a good leader who saw many battles. While he never gained further promotion than brigadier general, he acted as temporary commander in the battles of Antietam and Gettysburg. Williams is not well recognized as a Union leader, presumably since he never graduated from West Point as many of his superiors did. However, he didn't go completely unnoticed. A memorial in his honor was created in his hometown, Detroit, Michigan, and stands in Belle Isle Park. And Williams, of course, had a glorious beard. With a grown beard coming to a distinctive point on his chin, his beard divides into two particularly long sections on the side of the jaw that look like extensions of his big, full mustache. The history of the Civil War is still a vital part of America today, 160 years after its ending. Despite the dark times of the Civil War, many of the leaders made an influence on their soldiers and carried on with life after the war to rebuild what was broken. Beards and facial hair in the Civil War were an expression of identity, no matter what side they were on, and many of the unique styles and trends still carry on today.
Away, away, we'll all go down to Dixie.
You are listening to The Glorious Beard. Now it's time to head back to the 18th century to look at one of the more strange moments in the history of facial hair, and that comes in the form of the beard tax. We have figures like Peter the Great, a Russian czar who had ruled from the late 1600s to the early 1700s, who was on a mission to modernize Russia, borrowing ideas and aesthetics from Western Europe. Meanwhile, he introduced a beard tax in 1698, and if you wanted to keep your beard, you actually had to pay for the privilege.
In ancient times, rulers across the world issued taxes on things you wouldn't normally expect. Dogs, hair powder, bricks, even windows. The agenda behind these taxes could be attributed to either making extra money for their pockets or a means of forcing social change. There are still some bizarre things being taxed today, but one of the craziest things that has ever been taxed, and you probably guessed it, is beards. Most believe the idea of a beard tax all started with the King of England, Henry VIII, in 1535. However, historians can't find many records on this tax or if it even existed under his rule. Oddly enough, even though the king kept a face mane himself, he issued a tax on beards. Reportedly, it was not to pocket extra money, but to turn having a beard into a privilege, something exclusively available for the men that could afford the small fortune. King Henry VIII approached this tax with a graduated system with tax brackets. Men were taxed according to their social position in society. The higher the position, the higher their beards were taxed.
Things were going relatively good for the beard until Alexander the Great changed the rules. He ordered all his soldiers to cut their beards for fear that the enemy might have something to grab onto in battle. A few rulers started taxing the wearers of beards. Taxation was passed by England's King Henry VIII in 1535, even though he himself had a beard. Elizabeth I also taxed beards. Peter I of Russia also taxed his officials who wore beards and made them wear a metal sign around their necks saying that beards are a ridiculous ornament.
The tax was eventually dropped, but Queen Elizabeth I, the king's own daughter, later picked it up again, this time making a few changes of her own. Any beards past 2 weeks of growth were viable to be taxed. Anyone who wasn't willing or not able to pay for their beard was publicly shaved.
Human right to never shave in the day or night, no. The back Back in 1698 there was a man called Peter the Great. He did something truly weird. He brought in taxes for having beards. Oh no.
In Russia, Tsar Peter I, more famously known as Peter the Great, also issued a tax on beards around 1698. Unlike Henry VIII, though, there is more documented information regarding the beard tax imposed by Peter the Great. He wanted to build Russia's power at the time by learning from the successes of European countries. Russia at this time was separated from the world and wasn't able to protect itself sufficiently because it lagged behind other countries regarding technology. To modernize Russia, Peter the Great traveled around Europe under the alias Sergeant Pyotr Mikhailov.
Now at the time, Russia lacked the presence on the geopolitical stage of some European countries like England and the Netherlands, who were busy colonizing the globe. Jealous of them, Peter decided to visit some of these European countries to see if he could find out the secrets of their success. The catch was that he did it in disguise, and he visited English and Dutch schools, factories, arsenals, museums, and even sessions of parliament. He even spent some time working in Dutch and British shipyards to learn their innovative shipbuilding techniques. Pretending to be a member of the Russian Grand Embassy, nobody had any idea that he was actually the Tsar. Upon his return from his whirlwind European adventure, Peter decided to make a number of reforms to modernize Russia to the status of the European countries he so admired.
As soon as he returned to Russia, he issued the infamous beard tax to discourage men from growing beards, hoping that they would emulate the style of Europeans. This was not received well because the Orthodox Church saw beards as an important part of their religion and facial hair was highly encouraged. But Peter the Great's sudden tax created conflicting interests and alarm.
Traditionally, Russian men sported long beards, as long as they could grow, like wizards in a ZZ Top cover band. Peter saw this tradition as absurd and out of step with modern times, so he proclaimed a new law. Every man must shave off his beard. His new law met with great resistance. For some Russian men, their beard was a major symbol of their manhood. Plus, some guys just look weird without their beard. But Peter was adamant. He even went around court with a pair of scissors, cutting off the beards of any man who dared to show up wearing one.
Those who paid the beard tax received a copper or silver coin showing proof that they had paid their yearly tax. The coin had the phrases, "The beard tax has been taken," and "The beard is a superfluous burden," inscribed on the sides, along with an image of an eagle and the bottom half of a man's face, sporting a mustache and beard on the other side of the coin. Russian men were required to always have it with them, lest they risk getting shaved on the spot or several inches snipped off their long, luxurious beard. On the bright side, exceptions were made for priests, monks, and peasants. This beard tax was targeted at the upper class, since lower class men like farmers didn't frequent the castle or public buildings that often. However, when they did, they would pay a little for their beard.
The amount of tax depended upon the status of the bearded man. Those associated with the imperial court, military, or government were charged 60 rubles annually. Wealthy merchants were charged 100 rubles per year, while other merchants and townfolk were charged 60 rubles per year. And peasants were charged 2.5 kopecks each time they entered the city.
While Peter the Great implemented many great strategies that greatly improved Russia, the beard tax proved to be difficult for many men as it was costly, stripped parts of their manhood, and a part of their religious practice. His beard tax ended in the late 1700s, but that wasn't the end of the fight for men to keep their beards intact. History shows many other countries trying this tax out for themselves, such as France and Yemen, with beards becoming discouraged throughout most of Europe.
However, in the early 1850s, things took a drastic change. Victorian England had a high value on masculinity and courage, and the beard started to represent that. Many leaders adopted facial hair, including the first American president to ever have a beard, Abraham Lincoln.
Beards have come a long way throughout history, and even though there are places where beards and forms of facial hair aren't allowed, I'm sure we can all agree that we're lucky to live in a time where glorious beards can grow freely without being ridiculously taxed.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Glorious Beard Podcast, and a special thanks to our sponsor for this episode, Building Bridges for Brianna, a nonprofit working to prevent loss from mental health crises in Pennsylvania. Founded in memory of 15-year-old Brianna Dorgan, they connect individuals and their families with support and the resources that they need, while also helping communities to talk more openly about mental health. Visit them online at bb4bpa.org. Our production director at JXB Media is Bob McCoy. Our executive producer is Joseph Kay. Our associate producers were Damian Miller and Sabrina Delait. The fantastic writing staff on this episode featured a couple of new people like Naftali Kajust and Jules Williams, along with some old favorites like Kara Reeder, Kayla Martinez, Joseph Kay, and Bob McCoy. Our story editor was Joseph Kay. Special recognition goes to our social media team who's cranking out all of the fantastic content that you see on our Instagram and our YouTube. They're led by the amazing Sabrina Delait, and you can see their great work on our Instagram by searching The Glorious Beard. The people who made this episode sound really amazing in the editing room consisted of Alex Kapari, Ella Zing, Kylie Maratia, and Bob McCoy. And of course, there were some great voices on this episode who came courtesy of people like Will Hoskins, Anya the Quacken, Mary Mullins, Michelle Paleo, Damian Miller, and Bob McCoy. The Glorious Beard is a production of JXB Media, a subsidiary of Top Secret Television Productions. Be sure to like, share, subscribe, follow, and whatever stuff that your podcast platform allows you to do. And you can also find us online at thegloriousbeard.com. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.